Okay, so I think there might be a couple more joining us once we know Daphne's gone. Is she going home or to the
Hospital.
So we'll just get a couple more folks settled in, and it's a great delight to have Peter here today. As I said, you stepped out of the cathedral, but I've swapped out Camellia for you for the morning. But although I thought Camellia might have been back by now, but she'll watch this later this afternoon. So it's great to have you here. I look forward to having your presentation, knowing that you'll also be able to address questions people have and give us a holistic view and a faith-related view. So welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Greg, and I'm glad I can share with you again something of the climate reality. In June of this year, the Queensland government brought Al Gore, the former Vice President of the United States, to Queensland and ran a 3-day workshop, and 738 of us, I think, were trained, somewhere around about that figure. 3 of us from the Anglican Church up there, and it was a great privilege. And having completed that, we get this little green O, which is a symbol of the circle of life around the planet. And we're accredited to use all of his resources. And so this is a selection of the slides that he presented in one of the sessions of the workshop, which went for about 2 hours plus. But you're not getting 2 hours, right? Depends how much I talk, how long ago, but I estimate around about 45 minutes. But obviously this slide wasn't in there. The Anglican community worldwide has put the 5 marks of mission, what it means to be church these days. And they're not in any ranking order, so the fact that the environment is number 5 doesn't mean it's at the bottom of the ranking. It's just one of the characteristics of being church. And that's why it's highlighted there, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. And in 2007, the National Church of Australia had an environmental canon which was calling on all dioceses to limit their footprint. Brisbane Diocese adopted in 2009. Grafton has, but I don't know what date it was, but not all dioceses adopted it. As part of that, Anglo Green is trying to hold the diocese up for that, and we're making progress at general managers level now and archbishops and things. So before, just another greeny group, you just sort of push them on the side and don't worry about it. So hopefully we'll go through here, but because the previous one is also important and related to it, to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence in every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation, another mark of mission. They're the 2 that we focus on, but mainly the last one. How are we going at doing that as a globe? You may have seen back on the 29th of July was Overshoot Day, World Overshoot Day, which means on the 29th of July, we had used all of the resources that the Earth can produce in 12 months by the 29th of July. So the rest, we're running on capital and running it down, as we see the planet's running down. If everybody had Australia's standard of living and Australia's choices, we would have run out on the 31st of March. If we all lived at the Indonesian level, we'd actually make it through to the 18th of December. Of course, it's different countries, different lifestyle, but overall, 29th of July, we ran out of resources for this year. What did I just turn? Oh no, it's not showing up there, that's right. So, this is a view of the planet. Looks nice, doesn't it? It was Apollo 17 looking back at the Earth, and it's a picture you see all over the place on posters and things like that. But sort of when you get down to the ground, it's not so good at times. As we turn on the telly, bushfires all around northern New South Wales into Queensland, earlier than ever this year. So what we're going to look at is these 3 questions. Must we change? Can we change? And will we change? So the must is really the science behind it, what the real situation is, not what the politicians are telling us or pretending that the situation is, but the real situation. That's a picture from the International Space Station at the moment. And you can see there that little crust of life around the planet. That little blue line is looking through the atmosphere on the horizon from the International Space Station. And that's where your life is, basically takes place there and a little bit down below the ground. That's the crust of the planet. We talk about global warming and that. So what is this global warming? Well, as we all know, the sun shines and the rays of energy come down and they hit the planet and it warms the planet up, right? And some of that heat is radiated back into the outer space, and some of that that's being radiated is reflected back down because of the atmosphere itself. And depending on how much CO2 and other greenhouse effects are there, depends how thick that greenhouse layer is and how much of it reflected down. The more you put there, the more it goes down. So as the planet heats up, instead of taking your doona off and putting your sheet on, you get a heavier and a heavier doona on the planet, warming it up. So that's in simple terms, that's how it works. So where's all that pollution come from, or the greenhouse effects? There's a range there, the thawing of the permafrost, particularly up in Alaska. And unfortunately, all the predictions of that don't take account of the methane that's released as that permafrost melts in those areas. And that is 17 times more potent than CO2 in the as a greenhouse effect. So whatever predictions we're giving you, or that, it's going to be worse than that. It's not, it's a conservative estimate, rather than, I don't want to shock you or scare you, but that's the reality. But of course there's things like coal mining, industrial processes, industrial agriculture, land transport, landfill, forest fires, fertilisation, crop burning, coal plants, oil production and air transport, the major contribution. And we're dumping 110 million tonnes of man-made global warming pollution into the atmosphere every day. And that's a lot of energy. Come on, change. Something pressing on there. Why is it not changing? There we go. Global warming over since 1850 up to 2018. See the increase? People will say, oh, it's natural processes, but as we burn more fossil fuels, it's getting steeper and steeper and steeper, and metric tonnes of carbon in billions. We're up around the 10 billion metric tonnes of carbon going to the atmosphere.
Is that per year?
That's per year. CO2 has been released into the atmosphere faster than any time in the last 66 million years. And there's a graph measured of parts per million of carbon. You see it varies between about 120 parts per million by volume up to about 260. And yes, it does change naturally, going back 800,000 years before today, up to the present time. Natural variation, right? Climate deniers may have it right, except for the fact that, before we get to that, that's a correlation of the temperature of the planet, which we now can take through scientific analysis, like satellites. In the old days, we only knew what the temperature was locally. And the Weather Bureau would get phone calls from all the property holders in various key points, and they'd phone in their rainfall and their temperature and look at the sky and say, well, this type of cloud and that. But now we've got satellites that can look down and measure it all. And that's a correlation of temperature with CO2, and I reckon that's a pretty close correlation between temperature and CO2. The projection for 2019 is 415 parts per million. So instead of the natural variation, up here. And if we keep burning fossil fuels the rate we are doing, it's going to go up there in 40 years. 600 parts. And you imagine what that temperature graph's going to do if that happens. The energy trapped caused by man-made pollution is 500,000 times the energy of the Hiroshima atomic bomb every day. That's the amount of energy we're putting into the atmosphere. So as they measure the mean temperature of the Earth, you'll see going back to 1880, that's the mean coming up to now, which means all the hot stuff now establishes that mean. And it was much, much cooler until round about 1940 or so. Then we started going above the current mean, and then we had some cool times, and then some warm times. But look where it's going since 1980. It's getting hotter and hotter, running away. The 18 of the 19th hottest days on record in the planet have been in the last 19 years, and the hottest of those have been in the last 5 years. We all know it's getting hotter. And there's 224 locations around the world set all-time heat records in 2018. This is just Australia's figures now. That's the Australian anomaly of temperature variation from the norm here. And you can see the trend is trending up as well. The average annual temperature in Australia could rise by 5 degrees this century, before the end of the century. So last year we had 50s in some place. 55, what's it going to be like with 55? Parts are going to become uninhabitable. Not only in Australia, of course. Heat waves in Australia are already 5 times more likely. And there's just a record from last summer. And you'll see New South Wales, hottest summer on record, 21 days, about 40 or above at Burke. Queensland had a similar 43 consecutive days, 40 or above in Cloncurry, and other examples. The chance of getting that summer of 2018-19 by natural variation are less than 1 in a million. So the deniers can say what they think, the odds are the other way. Of the 100 hottest locations on Earth on the 24th of January this year, 91 of them were in Australia. We're exposed in Australia. We have a dry continent, we have a extreme. Yes, we are a dominant part of what's in the southern hemisphere, so the northern summer would be different.
That would probably have been relevant 100 years ago, though, that statement, probably.
What do you mean by relevant?
Well, they say 91 places were in Australia.
Well, it might have been the hottest days, but they wouldn't have been up in the 40s.
No, they're not talking about temperature, talking about relevance of the temperature.
Oh yeah, relevance.
So Australia 100 years ago still would have been the hottest,
still
would have had.
Still would have, yeah.
So
we're just using Australian examples because that's where it's Australia. Because not only that, it's not only the heat going up, it's the ice melting. I was just reading last night, I think, on the internet, that if the ice actually melts in Antarctica, where there's, what is it, an iceberg broke off last week.
Yes.
Massive. But if that all it will raise sea level 30 metres if it were all to melt. It's not going to happen in this century, but the extent of the Arctic ice is getting thinner and thinner. We hear about the polar bears that can't feed because the ice is too thin for them to go fishing, like to get their food, because they don't actually swim out for it. They go on the ice and break the hole and get it through the hole. And you can see a dramatic drop off of the ice in the Arctic. The North Pole's experienced mid-winter heat waves the last 3 years in a row, 2016, 2017, 2018. That's real live footage of a glacier in Greenland. It's sort of melting. Not sped up, that's real time. The oceans are heating up to depth. The satellites can probe the depths and get the temperatures, and you'll see the pink, the light blue is the top 300 metres of the ocean waters, 300 to 700, 700 to 2,000 metres, and then the darkest one there is below 2,000 metres. And you'll see each of those bands are getting wider and wider. So they're all getting hot right down to the depths. So the oceans really are heating up. And they're getting plastic. You see that picture on television? The submarine went to the deepest trough, and there was plastic in the bottom of the deepest trough. And half of this increase has been since 2000. You take that graph, that top half, in the last 19 years. All right, we all know the water cycle. A few years ago we had a drought in Queensland just before we had the flood, and we tried to supply Toowoomba with water, and they refused to accept it. It was recycled water out of the sewage plant. And I said, well, I suggest you give up drinking water if you're not going to drink recycled water, because all water is recycled unless you're burning hydrogen. And that's the water cycle, isn't it? It falls down as rain, runs down the rivers into the sea, gets evaporated up, and it just goes round and round in a circle. And of course the Toowoomba case was, so what do they do with the water instead of sending it to Toowoomba? They put it in the Somerset Dam, which went back into the water supply for Brisbane, and that water got polluted because it was more pure than the dam water was. So you've got to reprocess it again. People. As temperatures increase, water evaporates from the oceans. One of the arguments is, how can you have more droughts and more floods as a result of climate change? Seems a contradiction, floods and droughts. Well, this is how it happens. The water, the oceans predominantly is where the evaporation takes place, and as the evaporation is into the atmosphere holds it, and the warmer the air gets, the more water it can hold, right? In fact, for every 1 degree of temperature rise, it can hold 7 times more water vapour in the atmosphere. So since we live right alongside that big lake called the Pacific Ocean, and we get all that evaporation, you've got a lot more water in the air over there as it heats up, 7% more. And there's already 5% more water over the oceans than there was just 30 years ago, just held in the atmosphere, on average. There's a Pacific Ocean with Australia on one side. 93% of the extra heat trapped by man-made global warming is absorbed by the ocean. That's why the oceans are heating up, because it shines down on there. All that moisture in the atmosphere, especially when it's hottest up around tropical type areas, it generates those things called cyclones, or in the United States, hurricanes, same thing, just different name. And so you've got all that moisture there, you've got all that atmospheric change, and of course this year we had Cyclone Trevor came and went over Lockhart River, and it dropped 32 centimetres of water in 24 hours. It's a foot, or just over 11.9 inches of rain in 24 hours. Because what happens is holds more, but when it does drop, instead of standing under the shower, you're standing under a bucket, pouring down, all at the same time. And at the same time as Trevor was up in the north, we had another cyclone, Veronica, over in the Indian Ocean this summer, or the last summer. But of course, at the same time that the water's evaporating out of the ocean, it's evaporating out of the land too. You've only got to go around here or go over the range in particular, you can see just how dry the country is. So that moisture is just baking that land and drawing all the moisture out of it. And of course, as the country dries out, greater risk of fires, as we know in the news lately. Binnaburra, that got burnt out in the Lamington National Park, thought it was protected, it was normally protected, because it had rainforest around it. And if you go into a rainforest, normally you can guarantee at 4 o'clock in the afternoon it's going to be drizzly rain, because the forest generates. But as it dries out, the forest dries out, as the atmosphere dries. And the forest no longer protected Binnaburra Lodge, and so the Binnaburra Lodge was burnt out recently. And of course that's only one example of rainforests not protecting as they would have before. All of this causes catastrophes around the world. There's a graph of the mustard coloured here are storm damage, the blue is damage from floods and mudslides, and the red is the other extreme temperature damage, excessive heat, drought, fires. And you'll see again, there's a trend up and up. The graph goes from 1980 up to 2016. And those cost money to fix up the damage. Here's an example of how you get the flooding rain. The downpours get bigger, as I said, it's like under a bucket. This is a video from Arizona of a storm, would have been a hurricane or something. You can see almost the weight of the water in that cloud, and you watch when it rains. Phoenix. Might need one more clip. It starts to rain, you watch the rain. You can see it bounce off the ground. There it is. See it splashing up off the ground? That's how heavy that rain's coming out. If there's more there, down it comes. Alright, globally floods and extreme rainfall events now occur 4 times more often than they did in 1980. That's a weather map from North Queensland when those cyclones were around, the extreme rainfall. And Townsville, of course, was flooded. And there's some photos of the Townsville floods in February of this year. 1.7 million loss to the Australian economy from flood damage. Another photo of Townsville. And of course, it's not only towns, but stock was lost too, because as that rain went further west and flooded the plains, the stock had nowhere to go. There wasn't any high ground to get onto, and when they did try to move, they'd run up against fences, and they were sort of stopped there, and some of them drowned, and some of them, they just got stuck, and they were so weak, and the wind that followed, they died of exposure as much as drowning. And thousands of head of stock were lost. On January the 7th, the Flinders River that flows into the Gulf of Carpentaria looked like that, satellite picture, right? On the 10th of February, it looked like that. And the Fitzroy River there is 59 kilometres wide. So you compare that, that's mainly that flood rain running into the Gulf, just the amount of water that's going. And of course you get floods down, that's a Forbes photo from a few years ago. 2 degree increase in global temperature means 30% increase in extreme weather, rainfall in Australia. The Paris Agreement is to try and limit the global temperature rise to 2 degrees. At 2 degrees, we lose over half of the Great Barrier Reef. we will get 30% more extreme rainfall, we will still get more extended droughts, etc. And that's why what we're really trying to do is keep it to 1.5. We're already at 1 degree, and we want to try and keep it below 1.5. The Paris Agreement was stop it getting to 2 and hopefully get it to 1.5. But it means we've got to take action to do so. In the United States, since May 2010, there's been 17 events that were 1 in 1,000 year events, flooding events. Now, 1 in 1,000 years doesn't mean you get a flood and then you say, oh, we're good for another 1,000 years before we get the next one. It means that every year there's a 1 in 1,000 chance there's going to flood. Or if around here we talk more about the 1 in 100 floods or droughts or whatever. And that means every year you've got that 1 in 100 or whatever the ratio is. But it indicates if you had 17 in the last 18 years, which seems to be up to last year, 2018, then it sort of indicates it's no longer a 1 in 1,000 year chance, but your chances are going up. Again, the cost of extreme weather is increasing. The economic losses from extreme weather total $653 billion in the last 2 years. I think they're global figures. It's a lot of money going down the drain. Sydney's running out of water. That's a very early figure, photo in May. If you took a photo now, that dam would be much lower. But in May, that was the Sydney water storage.
It's not surprising when you get 200,000 immigrants coming into Mascot Airport every year. But they've said, oh, we've got to reduce that now, we'll only make it 160,000 new immigrants a year.
Well, just get them out of Sydney, put them where the rain is. The Menindee lakes are drying up, the Darling River's drying up because of water management as much as anything else. We do need to manage things. And the Western Plains are experiencing drought and dust storms. Dubbo, Western New South Wales, a lovely dust storm blowing in there. And even down into Victoria. It's all over the country. Globally in 2018, drought caused $28 billion worth of damage in 1 year. And of course, it's not only the developed countries get affected, it's the poor. And in places, this is Somalia, and there are 5.4 million people facing severe food shortages over there. Then you can say, well, let's stop them coming to Australia. Or we can say, do we have a humanitarian responsibility to have a global picture and not just protect our own little patch as a Christian response? There's 1978 to 2017, the dangers of fire. You see New South Wales is covered by a large extent of that dark brown sort of colour, high fire danger. And it's increasing, as we know from the news. And we all know about devastation from fires. We see it on our television. Just had it recently, haven't we? Last year, for the first time in central Queensland, those red areas, they reached the classification of catastrophic. And it was also last year when the Met Bureau added another band for temperature rises to add going up to 50 degrees. Because they weren't in the scale before. They're adding those scales. Bushfires in New South Wales, you know about them, there's no need to spend much time on those. And of course it's not only the habitation of the animals, it's the animals themselves are affected. These days the world's oceans are 30% more acidic than they were before the Industrial Revolution. They absorb carbon dioxide and water makes acid. And the Sydney rock oysters don't grow as big. The shells aren't as hard. The shellfish that the fish eat aren't as viable either. And the whole ecosystem is affected as the water gets more acidic. The Great Barrier Reef gets affected with bleaching, and the bleaching comes so fast that the next bleaching hits before they've recovered from the one before. And we've lost, they say, something like 30% of the Great Barrier Reef's already been destroyed. And some corals are surviving and adapting, but some species of the corals are just dead and going. And mainly in the northern area where it's hotter than the southern area. And the tourism people, all they can say is, oh, don't publicise that, all it does is scares the tourists. If they had a better policy, they'd get more tourists. They'd say, come and see it before it dies. Get more tourists in. People don't think things through at times, do they? The Great Barrier Reef to the Australian economy is worth 6.4 billion every year. You lose it, you lose that income into the Australian economy. From tourism and fishing and all the other things associated with the Great Barrier Reef. We have medical emergencies. All the tropical diseases are abandoning the tropics. Well, not abandoning them, they're coming further south as the weather gets hotter. And so every time I go to North Queensland, when I was donating blood, they say, how long were you there for? Do we have a dengue outbreak in Townsville while you were there? Whether they can take your blood or not. That's just a superficial thing. But all of these diseases, like, I need my glasses to read all those, but I'll read up here. West Nile virus, Rift Valley fever, I don't know how to pronounce that, Chagas, which we had in Montevideo, fungi, dengue, Zika, and they're all the outbreaks. And you see they're getting further and further south. They're not only confined to the tropics any longer as the planet warms up. 2006 to 2010, drought in Syria turned 60% of the fertile land into desert. So you lose your food production. People have to leave the land. 1.5 million people went into the crowded cities in Syria. Causes civil unrest. Lives opportunities for groups to start agitating there and complaining about the injustice of it, etc., etc. And it's been attributed to the Syrian war. Is one of the first wars as a result of climate change. The Syrian Minister of Agriculture stated publicly that economic and social fallout from the drought was beyond our capacity as a country to deal with it. That's just the beginning. We also, biodiversity is threatened. We're at risk of losing 50% of the land-based species before the end of this century. And that's why you have people, climate extinction rebellion people, and demonstrating to try and get people to do something about it. So in many ways, the cost of carbon goes up. And there's a list of some of the things that are expensive. It's a real threat to the global economy. And bankers and insurance companies are starting to write into their assessments climate risk. Even companies like BHP, which are miners, and in the coal business as well, are giving the bonuses to their CEOs that make mega bucks, bonus on the basis of have you reduced the footprint of the business, not on the basis of how much money they made. The companies are starting to realise that economically it's cheaper to act on it than it is not to act on it. There's going to be other costs, all the costs we've looked at. So, what's the situation at the moment? Well, there's subsidies for renewables, and some people complain about all the subsidies going into renewables. Well, globally, 143 billion was spent on government subsidies for renewables. But at the same time, fossil fuels got $5.2 trillion in government subsidies, which is 36 times the. So they're funding what's causing the problem rather than funding the solution or part of the solution. In Australia itself, fossil fuel subsidies are $30 billion per year. Government won't tell you that, but that's true. The emissions there comes from industry. Electricity is a major one. Transport, agricultural and waste are lesser amounts. But your biggest ones are electricity, transport and heating and the extraction industry of mining. Electricity generation, we get some from solar, some from wind, some from hydro, a little bit from biomass, some natural gas, and by far the majority comes from steaming coal at the moment. Okay? And they're 2018 figures for Australia. So, do you think we should change? Do you think we should respond to this?
Yes.
Oh, you agree?
Tell China all about it, they're burning all our coal.
I'll get to that in just a moment. But can we change? Is it possible to do anything about this? Because people get very depressed and say, too bad, it's too late, we can't do anything, right? We have the solution.
It is Peter, isn't it?
Yeah.
Peter, I mean, if we understand, if we're helped in understanding that we can do something, then we want people like you to tell us what to do.
Okay.
Because,
We'll get to that.
by ourselves, we don't know what to do.
Okay, we'll get to that in just a moment. We do have solutions at hand, and we can see projections. In 2000, it was estimated that wind generation of electricity would reach 30 gigawatts by 2010. That was the projection. It was an optimistic projection, they thought. But in fact, by 2018, 20 times that amount of wind energy is being generated. They underestimated what renewables would do in the wind industry. And there's a graph of wind industry from 1980 up to 2018, and you can just see the rise in the wind generating capacity across the world. And this one's, the rise is almost parallel or similar graph in Australia, building wind farms and things around Australia. The cost of onshore wind farms, the average wind farm you see, started off in 1984 at around about 200 euros or just over per megawatt hour generation. But over the years, look how that's come down. The dots are real figures and the dotted line is the projected, like you average it out if you're not used to reading graphs. And look at it now, down around 2014, we had a real figure below 50 euros per megawatt. It gets cheaper and cheaper to produce. There's an example of a wind farm at Kings Sand in New South Wales. Wind farms around Australia, that's how they're distributed, mainly because that's where the wind blows. Not as you put where the wind doesn't blow. And in Australia, wind and solar energy is cheaper to generate electricity than new coal or new natural gas plants. It's cheaper to generate by wind than it is to put in new coal powerhouse or a new natural gas powerhouse. Wind and solar power are already the cheapest new source of power in large portions of the United States, Canada, Australia, Latin America and India. In Australia, the cost of new wind and solar, even when you add the backed up, whether it's pumped solar or whether it's batteries, is still cheaper than the cost of new coal generation. The cost of generating electricity by coal is pretty much stable at around about $120 per megawatt hour. These are real 2018 figures, so it's adjusted for inflation and that. Natural gas is a bit cheaper and a little bit cleaner, but not very much cleaner. Burning coal, natural gas is fairly clean. The trouble is you get too much leakage in the gas lines and the connectors that escapes into the atmosphere. It's not so much burning it, it's the leakage along the supply system. Offshore wind was in this range, and now it's down cheaper than both of those. Onshore wind is cheaper still. Put wind farms on land rather than in the oceans. And photovoltaic cells at industrial level, not the ones on your roof, but industrial level, has always been cheaper, and it's getting cheaper at the same time. They're dropping as well. Globally, wind could supply the worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. If you just had wind in the right place and you could distribute it, or you put the industry where the power was, you could supply it 40 times over the amount of wind energy that's available to be built. But that's not the only way. Solar is another one. In India, Mr. Adani, who wants to open the Kalai Valley to low quality coal, it's lower quality coal than Newcastle coal. It's actually below the standard that the banks will invest in. That's why they can't get any investment. You've got to burn 17% more coal from the Kalai than you'd have to if you got it from Hunter Valley. And he wants to give power to the Indians. They can't afford to buy electricity. And what they're doing in India is putting solar panels on little houses, just like that. And they connect it up with a battery to the neighbour next door. So when I'm not using mine, you use it. I mean, you can meter it and charge it, that's right. And they have a little network in this village. Then the next village has its own little network. And that little network, those two connect together. And then another, and you grow a web by having all these networks interconnected. So instead of having long distance power lines sending electricity around the country, you're sharing it locally and getting that interaction and networks. It's a bit like the internet, isn't it? You've got everything interconnected. And that's what's happening in India, and that's the way they're going in some degree. Solar energy, in 1 hour, enough sunlight falls on the planet to fuel all the energy needs of the world for a whole year in 1 hour. So it's even more efficient than the wind. So people are going to solar. The world's solar installations are going from 1980 up to 2018, accelerating. Australia's solar also accelerating. The cost of solar panels are coming down. They started off up here at about $80 or $79.40 per watt in 1976, and at 2019 or coming to 2020, they're down to 25 cents per watt to generate, to buy the crystals. And so we're seeing solar farms being built around the place. Australia has 6 new rooftop solar panels being installed every minute on average around Australia. That's a map of where you can produce solar energy in Australia. These areas are ideal. They're a little long way away from where people live up here. And of course, as you get further south, it's less reliable. You don't get as much solar energy there. I'll just skip over in a minute. I'll digress a moment. There is a plan at the moment we heard about at the training to put a big solar farm in central Australia here and an undersea cable to Singapore, and we could export to Singapore all the electricity they need out of solar panels here. The technology is available. It's sent by direct current rather than AC that we normally use, and that is a current project under consideration and development.
It was actually in the news last week. It's going
been
ahead.
in the news, and there was another one up here in Broome to supply Indonesia, but that one's run into some financial issues or other.
Would they store the power that they receive from us? Would they? They'd have to have battery storage or something?
You could either have battery storage at either end. You can have it here,
Oh, yeah.
or you can have it at the other end.
Yeah.
Or you can use...
You'd have to have it though, because it
In
goes...
Singapore, they don't
Nah,
have wide
yeah.
open spaces to put solar panels up.
No.
But it's interesting, sometimes you've got to think about how you do that. In Casino, where I am, the shade covers over the Coles car park are all solar panels instead of cloth. They're actually done by the Services Club next door, $1 million investment or something, and they sell that power into the system.
That's fantastic.
You use the space. We've got all these rooms that the percentage of homes with solar panel in Australia is increasing. In New South Wales there it's 18%, and in Queensland it's 33%. So we've got a bit more tropical sunshine and things like that, as well as a bit more incentive to invest in them.
Excuse me, Peter.
Yep.
If Singapore is looking at a project like that, are there any other cities or main towns in Australia looking at it as well?
I haven't heard of any. If we re-engineer the electricity grid in Australia for direct current instead of alternating current, we could have a network out of Australia's desert feeding our cities with solar or clean energy. But it requires obviously a lot of investment, and it's still in the early development stage. The technology's there, and it's like all things, the scale cost comes down as you get bigger and bigger.
So in terms of that major investment, which would be, I mean, Australia has a future fund.
Oh,
So
Australia can be a major exporter of solar, of clean energy in many forms, for its own use and overseas. And CSIRO is doing some stuff I'll talk about on hydrogen as well.
So who's talking to investors?
Well, the trouble is, see, the federal government does not have a policy on solar, on renewables. And because of that lack of policy, it's only businesses that see the business opportunity and starts going. And the reason we've got so many dirty coal power houses still running is because we haven't had a policy, and so nobody would invest in new cleaner energy production because they didn't know what was going to happen in the life of it. But as the economic costs come down and it becomes far more economical to do it, businesses are jumping ahead of government. So, but if we had a policy, we could do it much faster. This is interesting. The clean energy investment in Australia, see how it peaks and then drops and then peaks again? This is when we had a carbon tax on. That's when we took it off. The country runs on economics, and if you don't put a price on something, then people aren't going to take any notice. So if you don't penalise people for producing pollution, which produces catastrophic events, and someone else has to pay for the damage, then they might get around to it eventually. So with the government policy, we were going like that. Take the government policy off, down there.
So how come we've gone back up again?
Well, because of the economics of it, the business and that's starting to do it ahead of the government. Now, our Prime Minister claimed in the United Nations that we're going to meet our Paris targets. We can only meet our Paris targets if we use Shonky accounting, because they're using Kyoto figures, and this is when the Kyoto Agreement was on, before the Paris Agreement, and at this time, because we were going and we had a carbon tax, we overproduced renewable energy. And the federal government is saying, all of that credit that we accumulated here and we overproduced, let's use it to offset our damage that we're doing now. And it's not recognised internationally as a valid way of doing it, but that's what they're claiming. And that's the only way you can claim that we're going to meet our Paris Agreement. And in fact, we probably won't, because we'll probably run out of credit at the rate we're producing pollution before we get there. Because every year our pollution's going up. It is not going down in Australia, it's going up. They quoted some figures the other day saying, per capita it's going down. because of population increase, we can pull it down a little bit. But we're still producing more and more pollution. It's just we've got a few more people to average it out with, if that's the figure you're going to use. But the globe doesn't know about whether you've got people here in Australia or in India or Africa. It just says, you're pumping it into the atmosphere and I'm getting hotter. And we're not doing our contribution. So, we can change. The technology's there to change. We need the will to change. Okay. New Delhi Centre for Policy Research made this statement. You'd have to be quite courageous to invest in coal in India at this point. They're all going to be stranded assets. The Adani coal mine, if it ever went ahead, which I hope it never does, is never going to make any money. It can't. They'll never pay the royalties that they offset because there won't be any profit there to do it.
And they're getting tax shelter in the Cayman Islands for 12 years.
Probably. All right. Where's that coming from?
Just a right click. It was a right click. Brought that up.
All of Australia's energy needs could be supplied by capturing just 0.1% of the solar energy that came in Australia. We can do it. Cost of lithium-ion batteries is coming down. You can see there. The solar plus batteries is beginning to transform the human civilization, according to Bloomberg. That's the famous big battery that was built in South Australia when the federal government claimed that because they had high renewable targets, that's why it blacked out, which was a lie. The reason South Australia blacked out that time was that the national controllers of energy generation decided it was not commercially viable to start up the gas powerhouse, which was designed to cover the gap, and they didn't turn it on. That's why it blacked out, not because. And what this battery has done is it's making money, hand over fist, because it's brought prices down in South Australia, and what it does is, because that peak is governed by natural gas, the price of it goes up depending on demand. So if there's a sudden rush for it, its price goes up. And what the battery does is take that peak off, because it can supply by battery until it gets over that hump and come down. So they're actually saving money with that battery. And it's making a profit. You can see the figures online. Another way of saving the planet is electric cars on the road. That's a graph of electric cars globally, both battery, plug-ins, hybrids, all of the combinations of electric cars. And starting back here at 2010 up to 2018, you'll see there's a global increase, and there's actually an Australian increase too. That's the Australian figure. New Zealand has a fifth of our population, but it's got 25% more electric cars than we've got. One of the reasons probably is they've got shorter distances and it's the range sort of thing. But still, they're using them. And a lot of our cars are in cities, they don't need that range.
They don't need the range.
But electric cars really only make sense if you're producing a lot of your electricity from
clean energy. That's right.
And to introduce them now when we're not, doesn't actually help.
Oh, you can buy 100% green energy now. You can choose to buy from your supplier.
But on a systems level.
Yeah, but the more people who demand green energy, the more renewables we're going to get.
Oh yeah, and from that perspective.
Yeah. But no, if you're fueling it by car, if you're in Victoria and just coming from brown coal, it's not very clean. But it's still better because you got that investment for the future. The fossil fuel powered cars. This is a standardised cost comparison. You see the cost of cars increase. We all know the cost of cars go up. Originally, electric cars were exorbitant, particularly in Australia, because they only imported the top models. They didn't import the lower models into Australia. But they are dramatically dropping, and it's predicted that by 2023 or 24, they'll meet. And it'll be the same cost to buy an electric car as it is to buy a petrol car. In Brisbane, we have this company, Atrium, which makes chargers for electric cars. And in fact, there are charges all the way down the coast of Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. You can actually drive a car now from Melbourne to Cairns, and there are charging points all the way along to charge it up within the range of the average car that's available now. And I saw just recently the NRMA here in New South Wales is installing these charging units around the place. And if you're a member of NRMA, you charge your car for free. It's in the news just a few weeks ago.
It does take a bit of time though.
It takes 20 minutes. These charges charge in 20 minutes. Time to have a coffee and a break. This company in Brisbane is manufacturing these cars. They're exporting 40% of their market to the US of A. They obviously go in Australia, but the high-speed chargers, which obviously need a special installation, so be it servos or equivalent of servos, rather than in your domestic home. You can charge the electric car on a domestic supply overnight, but it takes all night to charge. But with these charging ones, it's like your new phones, they get faster and faster charging on them than phones these days. But this company is going and so the thing is, will we change? One of the big things that people don't realise, probably the coalition got back in on the jobs issue in Queensland over there's a lot of confusion, and Mr. Palmer spent billions or millions and millions of dollars to make certain that the coalition got back, even though he didn't get any votes out of the whole thing, but he sponsored all the minor parties. Well, the minor parties got the vote, and the minor parties' preferences flowed to the government. And one of the main charges was that the renewables were anti-coal. Well, they're not most of the coal in Queensland, because most of the coal in Queensland is coking coal for making steel and not steaming coal for burning for power. I think it's 17% only is steaming coal in Queensland, because the Hunter Valley produces a lot of steaming coal and other places, that's where it comes from. But there are plenty of jobs in renewables. 21,000 renewable jobs now in Australia, doing wind turbines or solar panels. Over the last 5 years in the United States, solar energy jobs is growing 6 times faster than the economy. The installer of wind and stuff is the highest demand job in the United States, and the servicing of those is the second highest job growth in the United States. The United States already has nearly 5 times as many jobs in solar as they have in coal mining. Jobs are not an issue. Other ways you can do is energy efficient buildings. Retrofitting buildings for insulation, changing the light bulbs to LEDs, all those sorts of things you can add on. Of course, it's much more efficient to do it when you're building it, but and there are many jobs in retrofitting of things. 959 billion was went into building energy efficiency between 2014 and 2023 is the projection. It's a lot of economy, a lot of money. LED lights in 2010 was only 1% of the market. Up now, we're getting around, the estimate for 2020 is up here at 70% or nearly 70%, and the projection is by 2025, 95% of light bulbs will be LED these days in those projections. You see the increase as they're going. You can buy them fairly cheaply these days in Bunnings and places like that. You can get the old 4-foot fluoro tubes. When they go, you can replace it with an LED tube. And if you replace it, it'll hardly ever run out, because they run for years and years and years and years. And they just go in. You just take the old one out, put an LED one in. It just fits.
Plus a new starter.
No, you don't need a starter.
thought you had to put a new start. Like, that's what they came in the kit anyway.
I did.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I guess you did have.
Well, I thought the one we changed and only happened in one of the churches I was looking after. I think I just put it in. Maybe the old starter was still there. Worked on the old starter. The LED costs are coming down per unit. There they go. They started up here. What's this? Dollars. This is the overall down price of supplying the megawatt cost.
For lumen, yeah.
Get cheaper and cheaper. The Paris Agreement in 2015, every nation in the world agreed to have zero emissions by 2050, the middle of the century. Now, Mr. Trump decided he was going to withdraw when he got elected, but we're informed that the United States cannot legally withdraw until the day after the next presidential election. So, Australia's Paris Agreement is a bit chonky because what they've done is they put a very low target, 26-28%, but also they used the 2005 figure, which was one of the times when our emissions were very high. And so if you start from a high base, then it's a lot easier to reduce it. And if you're only going to reduce it by a lesser amount, you're not really pulling your weight. Innovation in the global markets rather than politics is going to continue to be the driver. Doesn't really matter who's in the White House, who's in Canberra. Industry is going to do it. But if there was more policy there, it'd be more stable and it'd become a lot faster, regardless of who's in power. Well, these are some examples of coal's on its way out, based on the United States. They're proposed powerhouses in the United States between 2005 2017, and every one of those proposals never eventuated. Every one of those dots. At the same time, those orange ones were plants that were in production but were scheduled to be phased out or retired. And at the same time, these blue ones are further retirements were announced. The other ones were already announced. These are new ones that were announced. Going down. All of those never eventuated in producing coal. And the American coal consumption, you'll see there, dropping dramatically. Between 2010 and 2015, these are completed coal-fired plants that are in the, or under construction in the pipeline. The number in the pipeline, 16 to 18, is fewer. These are the number of plants were actually commissioned to be built, but cancelled. And over here, 16 to 18, the number that were proposed and even commissioned, that means they were turned on and then cancelled. So all of those investments were stranded assets. 112 global financial institutions have announced they'll stop financing coal-fired power plants. 30 countries have joined beyond coal policies, to get policies beyond coal, and they're listed there. Australia's not yet joined, but the Australian Capital Territory has, Sydney has, and Melbourne have policies beyond coal. Of the Australian states, these are their energy targets. South Australia, all of them have got zero emissions by 2050, 50% renewables for South Australia by 2025, 100% renewable electricity by 2022 in Tasmania. Victoria is 40% renewables by 2025. Queensland, 50% renewables by 2030. ACT, 100% renewable electricity by 2020, that's next year. New South Wales doesn't have a policy.
Well done.
Not that I've heard of, they didn't have in June anyway. Northern Territories has just got 50% renewables, and they haven't actually said they're net zero by 50 either. So this is just some of the workers. It's a big solar farm up near Ayr, and there's some of the workers. They completed more clean energy projects than any other state in 2018. A lot of investment, and none of that investment was by the Queensland government. It's all been private industry and federal government subsidy for doing things clean on that renewable policy, where they sort of pay people to do it, which is they have to keep cropping up because it's not producing cleaner businesses.
And the profits go back to China.
They shouldn't do. It's the Australian Development Fund. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and it's requiring by 2045 100% electricity and be carbon free. See, countries are moving, individual areas are moving. We need to get national bodies moving, particularly in Australia here. Brisbane's targeted household emissions to drop by 43% by 31. Adelaide plans zero emissions by 2025. Sydney pledged 100% renewable energy by 2030 and zero emissions by 2050. The Opera House has announced in June this year it gets 85% of its electricity from renewables. Over 170 companies globally have made a commitment to go 100% renewable. It's called the RE100 Club. And there they are. I'm not going to read them to you, but there's some of the companies go 100% renewable by 2050. Australian company Atlassian, they're involved with that project to send power to Singapore. It's mainly a tech company, and they just recently announced this at our conference in June, but it was recently announced at the United Nations as part of the agreement this year to have 100% renewable electricity in all of its global operations by 2025. The first company to go RE100 in Australia. And that includes purchasing green, going back down your supply chain and cleaning it out all the way down. And that you'll see that global corporates are starting to act fairly slowly, but 2018 there was a bit of a peak, and hopefully that peak will keep going. China and India are both on track to achieve their Paris commitments. Although they still buy a lot of coal, they are pouring lots and lots of money into renewables at the same time, because it's the storage problem and the combination of both.
Hasn't China just set up the largest solar farm anywhere?
I wouldn't be surprised. They're building all over the place. And it's great that, you know, people are starting to move. There's a photo from the other day, 20th September, at the Anglican. We took part in the student march in Brisbane. You might find some familiar faces there. That was just in the park before we moved off. And another photo of we're in the section for faith groups, and some people keep saying, oh, the churches are behind this, faith groups are behind this. Well, we are, because we believe that God created this planet, the environment. We have a responsibility to care for it. Because that's our planet, it's a little bubble of life in space. So, after the final no, there comes a yes. Just we don't want too many more no's before we get to that yes, do we? And on that yes, the future world depends. So, what can we do about it? What can you do about it? There are a number of things we can do. I've got some sign-up sheets here. You can sign up to get the newsletter from Anglo Green or the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. And there we put notes and tips and things like that. We also, I've got a couple of sheets here for you. This one here lists some of the things you can do in the area of lifestyle choices, home improvements or operations around the home, transport, and lobbying, talking to your politicians, your local councillors, your state, your federal, to get them on side to get moving. Because it really is a crisis and it's important that we act now. Scientists say we had 12 years, now we've got 11, that was a year ago, before we reach a tipping point where it is impossible to come back and reverse the situation. It's just run away. You know, it's like a lot of things. You get to a point, tips over. And but we need to act. Every day we put it off, it gets more expensive to do it. And it's economically feasible to do it now. And I encourage you to do what you can to respond. Sorry.